Okay, well, I think we'll get started. A fundamental premise of classical physics is that the observer is independent of the observed. And of course, if you're doing an experiment, if that wasn't the case, then so a lot of the classical view of how you develop information would be in question. A popular view in the mainstream scientific teaching is that human thought has no effect on matter. Matter is out there, we're here, we don't affect it in terms of our thought. And that's consistent with a classical view that thought is simply an electrochemical brain phenomenon. And it's a fact that there's a growing volume of scientific evidence by credible institutions that indicates otherwise. Neither of those two things appear now to be correct based on what we know. I'd like to introduce to you Rustum Roy, the late Rustum Roy of Penn State University, colossus of a scientist. I knew him for many, many years. He was one of my closest friends, and he originally came from India. When he was a child, actually met Gandhi and sang a song for him, or recited poetry for him, I guess. So he goes back a ways. He was educated in India and got his PhD in ceramics at Penn State University. He ended up founding the Materials Research Laboratory at Penn State, which became the #1 laboratory in the world of its kind in terms of being cited by elsewhere in the scientific community for its papers. And he was simultaneously the Evan Pugh Professor of the Solid State Emeritus at Penn State, Professor of Geochemistry at Penn State, Professor Emeritus Geochemistry at Penn State, a Professor of Science and Technology and Society Emeritus at Penn State, all at the same time, and also a distinguished research professor of materials at Arizona State University at the same time, and a visiting professor of medicine at the University of Arizona. This guy was unbelievable. And he worked all the time. He'd normally go home about 11 o'clock at night. The funny thing about him was he always assumed that everybody else was working those kind of hours, so he'd call me at night. It's like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, think nothing of it. I wasn't working till 11 o'clock at night, but he assumed everybody did. Great man. He ended up, like me, he was an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineers, but unlike me, he was an elected member of 5 national academies. Russian National Academy, Swedish National Academy, the Japanese National Academy, and U.S. and India. Amazing guy. He received the Order of the Rising Sun with Gold Rays, which was the highest award given by the Emperor of Japan. He authored more than 600 scientific papers, 17 books, and was a renowned lecturer. So this guy was the real deal, and totally amazing man. He did, toward the end of his career, about the last 15 years of his career, he did a lot of work on the structure of water. Classically, science has taught that water is water is water. If you got pure distilled water, all water is the same, H2O. And that turns out not to be right. That's like saying, yeah, the elements in carbon. If you've got carbon, you've got carbon, you've got carbon. Well, if you give your betrothed a ring with carbon in the form of graphite, you'll get a very different reaction than if it's in the form of diamond. And like that example, it turns out that water has structure, and it is completely different depending upon its structure. They proved at Penn State that it consisted of oligomers, which are basically complex molecules rather than just H2 and O. would form oligomers that were as much as 250 molecular weight or as little as 1 molecular weight of H2O. And that the structure of water was influenced by epitaxy, meaning whatever the water is up against can affect its structure. It was influenced by electromagnetic radiation, different forms of electromagnetic radiation, light, microwaves, things like that, could dramatically change its structure and its properties. And that magnetic fields could change the structure. Stirring water with a magnet could change its structure, things like that. And bubbles could change its structure, which was very, very interesting, and started to be the beginning of being able to explain how homeopathy worked, which, you know, classically in mainstream science, they thought homeopathy was a lot of hokum because you'd go through these dilutions of something that was put in water, and by the time you'd finished all of these dilutions and the process of succussion where you'd shake it and everything, they thought it was a complete bunch of hokum because on average there wouldn't even be one molecule of the stuff that you put in the first place in the sample. And but actually, as it turned out, what you were doing was changing the structure of the water, and the succussion, actually the bubbles, could affect its structure just as much as the business of putting stuff in it, and progressively, when you put something in it and then you shake it, you transfer the structure to the water, and it eventually didn't matter whether you had any of the original stuff, the water in its structure would keep affecting the next dilution. So anyway, there were similar observations by many other labs, and a man who did some very interesting work, which many of you may have heard about, was Masaru Emoto. He had not very impressive technical credentials when it came to the physics and chemistry community. He had a BA in industrial relations from Yokohama Municipal University, and he was a doctor of alternative medicine from the Open International University in India. And that's not to take away from his credentials, but when you see the work that he was doing and the claims that he was making, the people who were experts in materials and structure and chemistry and all of that just listened to him and said, you know, no. But it turned out that his work was very valid, as proven subsequently, and we'll talk about that. But anyway, he would take, when he was studying alternative medicine, he became convinced that water did have structure, and that it had different structures, and he figured there must be some way to prove that. And the way that he came up with to look at how you prove that was he took a microscope and created a cold stage by putting it in a room where the temperature was like 4 degrees or something like that. You know, very cold, cold enough that water would freeze. And he took a sample of water that was a constant source for a whole bunch of his studies. He kept it under the identical same condition, and all of the samples of the water that he subsequently treated to look at effects on the structure of water came from the same sample. And what he looked at was taking a sample of water and then influencing it with various ways that he thought might influence its structure, and then taking a drop out of the sample and putting it on the cold stage where it would immediately freeze, and looking at the nature of the ice crystals. What did those look like? And he found that the ice crystals varied dramatically depending upon what you did to the water. Now, he wasn't typically, doing anything chemically to it. He would put the water in the test tube, and he would expose it, for example, to people's thoughts. Or, and the way that he would typically do that initially was he would write down a phrase or a word that carried with it a certain thought, and he'd tape it to the outside of the vial, and then he'd take water out of the vial and he'd freeze it and look at the crystals. And he found that, as you see here, he's showing some different crystal structures. He found that the crystals varied widely with what you did in terms of attaching thoughts to them. As examples, here you're looking at having taped on the words "you fool," which in Japanese culture would be actually more of an insult than in the English culture, but it was one of the worst things you might say to somebody. Here were the results. This sample actually has almost no crystal structure, almost looks amorphous. I mean, it had some, it was crystalline, but it was largely non-crystalline, and no beautiful crystals. If you taped the words "thank you" to it, you got these beautiful crystals like this, and the words "love" and "gratitude," really elaborate, beautiful crystals. And he did lots of this kind of thing, including taping names like Adolf Hitler to one, or Mother Teresa to one, and things like that. And he found that the positive, the ideas that were associated positively tended to create beautiful crystals, and the ideas that were expressing hatred or unkindness or things like that tended to create very misshapen crystals, or even no crystal in the structure at all. Well, this was interesting. My friend from Penn State that I described, Rustum Roy, was one of the experts in the world on crystal chemistry, and when he heard about Masaru Emoto's work, he was open-minded, because he always was, but he didn't jump to any conclusions that this was true, because he knew that there were all kinds of things that can influence crystal structure. Well, so he didn't get very excited about quoting Emoto's work to people, but he followed it, but it didn't make his lectures. But then Dean Radin, who had, like Rustum, credentials as long as your arm, and was open-minded, decided that he would, in fact, set up some experiments to independently verify whether this stuff was true or not. And he was originally he got a BS in EE and magna cum laude in honors physics from Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a PhD in psychology from University of Illinois. He ended up working for a while at Bell Labs, which is top research organization, and was at University of Edinburgh and University of Nevada, SRI International, Interval Research, Boundary Institute, all of which have very excellent credentials. Became the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences on the West Coast. That's the organization I mentioned that was founded by Edgar Mitchell. Has written over 200 articles and over 350 interviews and talks, given more than 350 interviews and talks. He's an invited speaker at Harvard, Stanford, Cambridge, Princeton, and Sorbonne. He's guest on Oprah and Larry King, BBC, PBS, etc., etc. Anyway, this guy had tremendous credentials, and he looked at the effects of distant intention, not just taping something to a bottle, but actually having people focus on a sample from a distance and look at that effect on water crystal formation. So not only would they tend to prove Emoto's hypothesis that thought could influence water, but they could they could show that it was a non-local phenomenon. So if it worked. He set up double-blind test conditions. He worked with Emoto in setting up the tests, but the Institute of Noetic Sciences did the test. And they had 4 bottles of identical commercial water, and 2 were the target bottles in an electromagnetically shielded room. Had a couple of secret controls that he put somewhere else without telling anybody where they were, so that nobody would focus on them. And they were all at the same temperature, all in the same facility in California. They had 2,000 people with Emoto in Tokyo focus for 5 minutes an intention on a photo of the target bottles, and they were 5,000 miles away. The ice crystals from samples were taken, the samples, both the controls and the targets, and they were photographed on a blind basis. The people who photographed them didn't know whether they were controls or they were regular ones. Had 100 independent judges rate the crystal aesthetics from 1 to 6 as to whether they were beautiful or ugly or in between. And came up with 4,000 ratings of 40 different crystals that were the product of the exercise. And the targets were aesthetically judged to be significantly superior to the controls. And the odds against that being a random result were calculated to be about 1,000 to 1. And he did the same experiment over with a new set of judges with similar outcome. They were like 500 to 1 odds. So basically, this was the data here. And you can see that the average of the targets versus the controls was quite a bit higher in its rating. And as I say, demonstrated pretty clearly that, in fact, you could affect the structure of water from a distance mentally by intention. Another guy I'd like to introduce to you is Glen Rein. And I'll back up to for a moment. As you know, when I started this segment, I said that basically a classical view was that thought couldn't influence matter. Obviously, the previous experiments did show that thought influences matter. Glen Rein is a brilliant scientist and from Pittsburgh, Boston University, got his PhD in biochemistry at University of London. Was on the research staff of Harvard Medical School and became an assistant professor at Mount Sinai Medical School, then a research scientist at Stanford Medical School, and became the director of biomedical research at the Institute of Heart Math, which is world-renowned actually now for a lot of their leading-edge work in the heart and what's going on with the heart and fields that the heart generates. He was then a senior principal scientist at Estee Lauder for a number of years, and is now the director of quantum biology research labs. He's on currently a number of prestigious boards. Has done lots of guest appearances and publications, and has all kinds of honors that are too many to mention here. But a very respected scientist. What he and others proved was that water stores information, that you can actually take frequency information, and you can, frequencies are information, frequency information from electromagnetic sources and other sources, and you can imprint it on water and store the information in water. And they then demonstrated that this water being structured could create effects on biological organisms. You could accomplish the imprinting via electromagnetic sources and what he called non-Hertzian sources. The non-Hertzian refers actually to Nikola Tesla, who was one of the early ones of the modern age to realize that there were fields that were there were sources of energy, quote unquote, which really weren't classical energy, that that appeared to have a non-physical basis. And examples of non-Hertzian sources could be created via technologies, some of which I'm very familiar with and was involved with. The Russians developed technologies for creating non-Hertzian sources. There are others. And thoughts were examples of non-Hertzian sources. That is, you could actually found that you could imprint frequency information on water via thoughts. Our bodies, of course, are mostly water, 70 to 80% water, depending on age and hydration, how much water you drink and all that. And so is our food mostly water. So the implications that you could imprint information into water, again, was consistent with the whole homeopathic field, and also had implications elsewise. And the fact that thought could influence the structure of water, and Emoto, and then verified by Radin, had proven that in fact thoughts could influence water in addition to Rein. If you go back to the origin of grace, I believe that that was actually the origin of grace initially, was that since our food is mostly water, we could actually change the structure of water in the food, which actually could have an influence on the structure of water in our bodies by expressing gratitude. And Emoto pretty much proved that. Most people that say grace don't really make a connection between the two or understand technically and physically how that actually can work, but it does. As I say, it explains homeopathy. It also explains some of the phenomena that are coming about where there are certain colloids which have just teensy amounts of materials in them that are suspended in them. One of the best examples being silver colloids that are marketed today with like 10 parts per million silver in it. The water out of your tap has more stuff in it than that does. But silver colloids have been found to be capable of eliminating a lot of, and the question of what's the mechanism is a separate question, but via their structuring of the water, eliminating pathogens such as viruses and bacteria in water and in liquids and in food and things like that. Roger Nelson is another person whose work I want to talk about. He was a PhD from Johnson State College in Vermont in cognitive psychology, became a professor there of psychology and a research coordinator at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratories at Princeton University. And Pear is known around the world for having really done a very good and careful job of investigating phenomena, engineering anomalies. And actually, Dean Radin was from Princeton, spent many years at Princeton. Roger Nelson became the director of a project called the Global Consciousness Project, which both he and Dean Radin were involved with at Princeton, which then got taken over by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. This was a really fascinating project where they looked at the ability of thought to influence devices, in this case, electronic devices. And these were electronic devices that were so-called random number generators. Random number generators, there are mechanical versions and there are also electronic versions. Nowadays, most of them are little computers, solid state devices, which are used in cryptography for generating codes, or for also in lotteries for picking random numbers out of a lottery, etc. And of course, the classical view is, of course, you can't influence those things mentally. They just do their thing, and that's why they exist. Well, they now have 17 years of data in looking at 496 events in which there were global events in which a large number of people focused on a single occurrence. And it doesn't really matter whether it's the ball dropping at New Year's Eve, or it's the Miss America pageant, or the Super Bowl, or whatever it is. Any of those events where you get a lot of people focusing on something, they found that there was a phenomenon. Originally, it was noticed on a few random number generators that when a lot of people focused on anything, the random number generators would start to become non-random. They'd start putting out order rather than just random stuff. And then they started, this started to be proven first at Princeton, and then they started continuing this work and gathering more data, and linked up with other random number generators around the world to where today I believe there are approximately 70 random number generators around the planet where people are continuing to gather data to determine whether in fact human consciousness starting to focus in any significant amount on an event changes the random number generator outputs. And the answer is it does. And that was really a startling discovery. Now there is so much data to prove that that is true. The odds that now exist now on that phenomenon are more than 1 trillion to 1 against the results that they have proven for it to be a random occurrence, for them to put out this kind of order. I don't know that there's anything in life you could point to that has better odds than 1 trillion to 1. So it has been proven, I think, beyond any shadow of a doubt now, over the 400 and nearly 500 trials. Jack Houck, I'd like to introduce you to. The late Jack Houck was a friend of mine, and I actually worked with him on a daily basis for about 6 months at one point. Jack got his degrees in aeronautical engineering from the University of Michigan, was a systems engineer at McDonnell Douglas, first McDonnell aircraft and McDonnell Douglas, and finally became a senior scientist at Boeing after Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas. And Jack, back when he was at McDonnell Aircraft, McDonnell himself had a fascination with anomalies. If he heard about anomalies, he wanted to investigate them and find out, is this really true? Is this true? And Jack was a crackerjack of a scientist, so he would send Jack Houck out to find out, is this real or not? And of course, some of the things Jack looked at were hoaxes and things like that. But some of them, interestingly, turned out to be true. And over the years, with all of the exposure to this stuff, Jack became very interested in psychokinesis because he saw evidence that psychokinesis, that is the ability of the mind to move or affect or even deform matter, was something that he became totally convinced of. And he developed, from his exposure to all of these different events, different cases, quite a bit of understanding about what it really took to do those things and why they occurred and everything. And he ended up inventing what he called the PK party, which was a psychokinesis party in which he would invite people, and he would, I believe, would require a minimum of 25 people coming to the party, because one of the things that he found was it was easier to do things like spoon bending, for example, and that was the purpose of his PK party, was to teach people to spoon bend and to take a piece of flatware and take it and focus on it and mentally cause changes in the material so that you could cause it to bend easily. And in his terminology, if the person could take it and they focused on it and then they were able to bend it easily, but they were holding on to both ends and bend it into a curly Q. That was kind of the kindergarten level. And then the high school level was when they could get to the point that they could take something that was that their physical strength wouldn't be enough to ever have bent it and bend it. And the graduate level was if they could take it and hold one end of it and cause it to bend just without even touching the other end. So anyway, the last I heard of Jack's parties, he had hosted more than 360 PK training events, PK parties, for more than 17,000 people. And not all of the people at the parties could do it, but a significant number of them did do it, and all of the other people at the parties could see them do it, and so it was having an effect of opening people's thoughts. Well, this was a spoon that was bent at a PK party. In this case, it was bent by Dean Radin, who was a healthy skeptic, but Dean was a superb scientist, and he came up to one of Jack's PK parties, and because he was a superb scientist and a superb engineer, he knew that like bending the bowl of a spoon is much tougher than like bending the shank of a spoon and all that. And in fact, he didn't have enough strength himself to be able to bend the bowl. And this is a spoon that was bent by Dean Radin. And he was focusing on bending the bowl, and he was holding the spoon with just 2 fingers on both sides of the bowl, and he was trying to focus on it, and he looked over and he saw somebody else bend one. And at that point, his bent, and he was able to bend it this far, as you see it here, in different photographs. This was silver-plated dinnerware, and he was really impressed himself by the fact that, wow, he could successfully bend it. And a key element of it was that Jack taught was that you set your intention, and he would give you some guidance as to how to go about it. But a key event that had to happen for anybody to bend one is to, once you set your intention, then let it go. If you continued to focus on it and everything, it wasn't going to happen. But if you let it go, then that's when it would happen. Here is a video, actually, that Jack took at one of his PK parties, where he had a novice come to the party, and he was holding a spoon like this, and he was focusing on it, on the middle of it, but he was just holding it by its 2 ends, focusing on it. And I'll let you see what happened. There it is. That was it. You heard Jack shout, "Now." What happened when Jack shouted "now" was he interrupted the guy's thought, and so that he broke his focus on it, and that's when the thing went, popped apart, and he was successful at breaking it. I'll see if I can trip it again.
Was there established sort of a length of time you had to focus before that would happen?
No, it depended on the person. You can see him hold it, but it's sort of like this, came apart. Well, Jack, being a very careful scientist, he had a brother to that spoon, and he put it in a tensile tester at work, and it took more than 800 pounds to pull that apart that way. So this guy didn't just pull it apart with his fingers. I mean, that thing, and if you look at it very carefully, and I'm not sure you can see it in this case, but if you could look at it very carefully, you would see at one point when it's about to break, it sort of lights up right here. I don't know if you can see it, but if you get real close to it and you look at it, the spoon all of a sudden lights up at that point, and it just flexes and pulls apart. So that's not supposed to be possible. But it is, and as I say, he gave more than 360 PK parties. One of the other things he did was, unbeknownst to the people in the PK parties, again, Jack was a superb scientist, he had a theory that in fact this coherent field that would be generated by having 25 or more people there would cause the destressing and relaxation of metal. And so he brought with him a stack of hacksaw blades that are tempered so that they're very hard. So, He didn't tell anybody he brought them. He just brought them in a sack, and he put them over in the corner for the PK party, and then he went home and he tested. And he tested the hardness of them before the PK party and the hardness of them afterwards. And he did this for several parties. Well, what he found was that he tested for Rockwell hardness, and the attention of the attendees, as I say, was on bending the flatware. Here's the actual data, but what you're actually looking at here is Rockwell C hardness, and these are the different samples over time, and these are the different PK events that they attended. And the samples over time went from very hard, up hard enough to saw steel with these hacksaw blades, down progressively lower and lower until they were the equivalent of totally annealed steel, which would be what you could cut with those normally. They just relaxed progressively. So he was exactly right. The field, the coherent field there, caused the material to just relax. And that was quite an interesting result also. Very well done scientifically. So here's a clairvoyant healer here in the middle, this woman here. And this was done at Rustum Roy's lab at Penn State, the materials research lab. And what they did was they took there's a device called a Raman spectroscope that will look at the backscatter. It's used to look at the structure of water or solutions or things like this to tell what structure they have. And they have a laser probe, and instead of putting it in water, it normally detects backscattered photons. If you don't aim it at something, then you just get a background trace. And they tried having Judith Judd, who is a so-called energy healer, come and just put her hands next to the probe. And this is what they found. This is the backscatter. This is the trace for just the probe by itself. And it also was the trace when Rick Hoover put his hands next to the probe, and nothing going on at all. But when Judith Judd put her hands next to the probe, you see the probe in certain frequency ranges goes way off and is detecting all kinds of backscattered photons, seemingly generated from thin air, and measured by the probe. Demonstrating that here was this healer that, according to classical physics, she's just waving her hands, but in fact they're able to actually demonstrate an effect in this case of seemingly synthesizing backscattered photons, or photons are so-called particles of light, out of nowhere. Interesting. And she does this by getting in a certain mental state. So again, here's something mental affecting something physical, in this case a device, by seemingly generating material. Valerie Hunt, another person that is quite extraordinary, the late Valerie Hunt. I knew Valerie, and she was absolutely an amazing woman. I've heard her lecture a few times, and when she would lecture in Washington, she lectured twice at one event, two different circumstances, and she was the only speaker to get a standing ovation both times. And nobody else even got a standing ovation once. She got a standing ovation both times. Amazing lady, got her BS in biology at Florida State, and master's in science at Columbia, and a teaching degree in science at Columbia, and was at Iowa State, UCLA, had most of her career at UCLA, and became a professor emeritus at UCLA. She died when she was in the 90s as director of the bioenergy fields lab. That was her own lab. I met her when she was in her late 80s, and she's taught at taught courses at more than 20 medical colleges and universities. She's a revered lecturer and authored 3 books. She was well known for having developed data on what's called electromyography. She used a very sensitive detector to detect the fields that surround living beings, mostly focused on people, and found that there were layers in the human aura. She could actually herself see auras very clearly, and I spent a number of days with her in California. She invited me to her home, and got to know her fairly well. And she was able to see people's auras, and actually the reason why I was invited to her home was she could see my aura, and she could see information in it that I was supposed to do something important that I would not do unless certain things happened. And so even though she didn't do this anymore, she was in her late 80s, she invited me to her home, and she proceeded to use a hands-on technique with me to make my field more coherent so that I could see some information that I wouldn't have been aware of otherwise. And it was quite a phenomenon. Anyway, she knew auras existed, and so she spent a lot of her career trying to detect the human aura and understand what it was from a physics point of view. And she used a very sensitive electromagnetic detector called an electromyograph, and was able to detect layers in the human energy field. And it really isn't an energy field, I have to tell you, but she thought it was an energy field, and many people have called it an energy field because she could detect this weak electromagnetic energy. Actually what it really is a field that can cause a manifestation of energy, and it was actually causing electromagnetic energy to exist in low levels, which she could then measure. So she was actually measuring an effect of the aura, but more significantly, she found that by applying certain mathematical functions to it called Fourier transforms, taking the data and processing it through a certain type of Fourier transform, that this would yield unique frequency patterns that would correspond to consciousness states and aura colors. That is, she found that what people who could see auras like she could, she could measure with the electromyograph certain electromagnetic frequencies that corresponded with that, so that you could actually use a device to tell what colors were in the person's aura. Or when I say colors, those are how they appear to people that can see them, but they're non-physical. They're not actually light, they're not actually color, but they're interpreted as color by those who can see them. And actually anybody potentially can do that, and there are many people nowadays that train people to see auras. But most of us, by the time we're 4 or 5 years old, have lost our ability to see them. And unless somebody trains us, for most people, they don't remember that they used to see them, and they don't realize they can't. But anyway, she found they also corresponded to certain consciousness states as well, depression or anger or things like that, and she could measure that. So she did a very good job of observing what was going on there and proving that there was a field that surrounds all living beings. And also, she observed a very interesting thing, that when she had healers that would come and work on somebody, she would look at the healer's pattern, and she would look at the person who's being worked on, and she would find that what happened was pattern matching. That is, the person being worked on, those frequencies that were in the healer started to show up in the other person's aura, and when they actually got to the point where they matched, the person tended to manifest healing. So she was able to actually see a mechanism operating there where the person was frequency matching, not intentionally, and they were just sitting there and the healer's working on them. And the healer working on them wasn't necessarily trying to get them to match, they were just doing their thing. But what would happen is the aura of the one person would start to match the frequencies of the aura of the other. And when that happened, they found that healing was happening as well. Konstantin Korotkov is a Russian, educated in Russia, and is a professor of research, and developed a technology called a GDV camera, which used something called Kirlian photography. I don't know whether all of you or any of you are familiar with Kirlian photography, but Kirlian photography, Kirlian photography was first observed in the 1930s by a husband and wife team, where they found that if you put a person's hand or a leaf or something like that against a photographic plate in an electric field, you could actually take a picture of a field that surrounded the hand. And interestingly enough, if you took a leaf that you just picked that was alive, you could see it around the leaf still. And if you cut the leaf in half and threw half of it away, for a while you could even see the other half of it still there, the field, but would slowly decay to match what was left. But anyway, Korotkov came up with a detector that was non-photographic, where he would have you put your fingers on the detector one at a time, and the detector would your field would affect the electric field in such a way that it could be actually then taken and run to a computer and correlated over time, much as Valerie Hunt did, but this was way above a different level, where they could interpret what your psychological states were and what your physical states were by virtue of your field being measured by this camera. And the bottom line is, it's a piece of technology that now there are over 1,000 of these in Europe that are actually medically approved for use in Europe and in Russia. They're not approved in the United States at this point, but people have GDV cameras, and it's able to show you an idealization of the aura. He's given lectures on this, and in training sessions and everything, seminars in more than 43 countries, and published more than 200 scientific papers and 9 books on this subject. But this is like the GDV output. This was an aura of a Qigong master named Master Tu, and shown by the machine. Then Master Tu intentionally altered his mental state and completely generated a different output as a result of it, showing again a relationship between thought and this field that surrounds a physical body. And again, the idea that thought doesn't affect anything out there was obviously nonsense. Not only did it affect his field, but his field was being measured by and therefore affecting this computer-based device. Bill Tiller, as a man, I was on the scientific advisory board of Friends of Health with Bill Tiller for about 8 years. He got all of his degrees and advanced degrees in engineering physics from University of Toronto. He was an advisory physicist to Westinghouse Research Labs and a professor emeritus in materials science for many, many decades at Stanford University. He's a founding director of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and he's authored more than 350 scientific papers, 4 books, and has numerous patents on his work. Tiller did some really interesting work on showing the effects of thought being able to be captured and programmed and used to program a computer device called an EEPROM. And an EEPROM hooked to an oscillator. He built a circuit in the device where he could have people intend to change the acidity or alkalinity of water or a liquid and they could program it to do that, and it could actually change the alkalinity or of acidity of the liquid, and you could measure that. And this was really result-based programming. The people that he had programming the EEPROM, they didn't know how to program an EEPROM so it would change pH. They just intended that it would change the pH, change the acidity or the alkalinity. And lo and behold, it did. And you could measure it. And not only could they do it, he ended up being able to show that they could do it, and you could move the unit from here to there and everywhere, and the unit would remember and would continue to do that. But more impressively than that, he found that he could station the people that were programming it anywhere. He could put them 100 miles away and have them program that EEPROM and have it do its thing. So it just violates all the classical views of how everything works and all of that. That here with thought, and with just intention, they could actually program a computer-based device to create a certain physical effect. And he demonstrated that thoughts can influence matter locally and at a distance, and in this case not only matter but a device, that information can be stored in matter, yet a different way, in this case in a computer, and that living beings have a surrounding field that correlates with thoughts. And all of these things are demonstrated by the various technologies that I've described here in this section.